Hello, in our conversations with Africa's leaders, today we speak to Cindy Mabaso-Koyana, an accomplished corporate leader, private equity principal, and a trailblazer in advancing governance and women's empowerment in business. With an extensive career spanning finance, investment, and leadership development, she's played a pivotal role in shaping Africa's economic landscape. As the founder of the African Women Chartered Accountants, AWCA, and a leader in several high-profile organizations, she's dedicated her work to ensuring that African women have a seat at the decision-making table. Cindy, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the BRICS Africa channel.
Thank you very much, Peter, for inviting me.
Cindy, let's start here. Often when I speak to business leaders, their careers are well documented and their achievements are recognized. But a lot of that story begins very young, at a very young age. And I wonder if that's been the same for you.
It has been. I was brought up, born and bred in KZN, in a home that was led by a single parent. My brother and I had the honor, I would say, to be grounded in very simple values that my mother, who was a very serious disciplinarian, grounded in us of humility, respect, hard work, and basically making sure that when you get given a role or an assignment, it gets done to fruition. So she really helped me hone in those values very early in my life.
And then you went to university and studied accounting. What led you there?
I also had a privilege of doing accounting at school, which was introduced as a new subject at the school that I was at in the township in Umlazi. So really very fortunate. And also with my love for numbers, after completing matric, when one of the career guidance, I'll say advisors came to the school, they indicated that there is a career I could follow if I was doing accounting and maths, and that is chartered accounting. So it was really introduced to me by chance, and then I landed in this route at the University of Natal in Pietermaritzburg. Very fortunate to get a bursary from one of the companies that was supporting the township school at the time. And that for me was really a breakthrough because without it, I would not have had an opportunity to go to university. As indicated, brought up by a single parent who was a general worker at a hospital outside of Umlazi. And that was basically her only job for more than 30 years, in fact, precisely 38 years. And so as a cleaner, porter in a hospital, it was very clear to us that you finish school, you go and look for a job. With accounting, I was really headed to go and be a bank teller, and I knew that I'll be home dry once I've done that.
So the numbers, accounting figures, that's something that stayed with you. Would you say then that you found your natural bent in this environment? I know a lot of accountants have gone on to do very different things from their accounting training, but finance and numbers seems to be something that's kept you in the game.
I've stayed in the space, yes, indeed. I've had the privilege of being in a number of finance roles, and in particular, the main one that really was a driving force in my career, early days of our democracy, when our government was very intentional in nurturing Black talent, Black excellence, was being appointed CFO at Transnet. And so around that time, really, it set my career in the finance space. Having said that, Peter, indeed, I love numbers. One of the things that is actually quite interesting at the same time is that I also have love for people. So in some of these finance roles, for example, at Ernst & Young, when I was responsible for the public sector, one of my responsibilities was people, which generally gets called human resources.
Yes, I remember a time when the accountants ended up wearing many hats, and human resources was certainly one of them. Things have changed over time. And you
Right.
find yourself doing leadership and pursuing leadership roles in environments often dominated by men, such as private equity and corporate governance. Talk to us a little bit about that.
So what has been, an equalizer, as you'd say, is having a good education. One was fortunate, even going to a township school, one had the best teachers. So for me to then qualify as a chartered accountant very early in my career, it became very clear that this is a profession that will allow me in spaces that naturally were not open to Black people. I was probably one of the top 10 qualifying Black African women CAs in the country when I qualified in 1995. And at the time, there was less than 2% of Black women who were chartered accountants. So when you include Indians and coloreds today, we now sit around 20%. So coming to then being able to play in these spaces, you know, financial inclusivity for me meant I needed to hone in industries which are about finance, and that was financial institutions. So private equity became a space where one landed after a long journey where we had started an investment holding company, Peter, at a time when our country, again, trailblazing in the area of developing those that were traditionally not open into the economic space. So BEE was a catalyst for most Black people and Black women to get into the private equity space, because back in the day, we will do deals that will largely be vendor financed, where you depend on the company vendor financing you, or go and raise capital against that asset that you're looking for. And sometimes by the time you raise the funding, if you were lucky, the deal is gone. So raising a fund was quite important as an advantage in playing in the space. What also assisted was that the financial sector charter, again led by our government. Our government has been a great catalyst in transformation, in driving diversity and inclusivity, because financial institutions then had to support and incubate Black women-led private equity funds, and also even pension funds have had to carve out some capital to allow women to play in the space.
So hindsight is 2020 vision, and I just wonder, looking back now and all the experience that you've managed to get, what would you say are the key traits to effective leadership that you think that every leader must possess?
It is very important, Peter, to take leadership as a responsibility, where it is about ensuring that you leave a legacy, you are given an opportunity to lead others. So the importance of walking the talk in leadership is critical. We find that as leaders, we will be saying things and or even dishing out instructions on things that we ourselves are not seen to be doing. That for me became quite critical. The issue of, and that's linked with accountability, where we remain accountable to those whom we are and responsible in leading. The other key issue around leadership is always being conscientious and conscious around, so what will I be leaving behind? As a people, how do I impact them? What drives me in my journey of leadership is that those who come across me need to move away, or I must walk when we part ways. It needs to be very clear how they were impacted by me as a person, as a society, and as a grouping of people, or even the organization. There has to be something that is very key, that is clear, was left behind, because I was given this responsibility and the honor of leading an organization.
Tell me some of the lessons that you learned, particularly working for global organizations like FIFA, about leadership beyond South Africa.
Yeah, so that was quite an interesting one. And again, as you touched on my role of governance earlier, this role came about as someone who would bring in some governance reforms in an organization that was largely known globally to be self-governing. So now it turns a lot of money. It's a cultural organization that also brings together a number of cultures. So what I learned is, you may be an expert bringing some expert contribution or advice into an organization. It is very important to grow yourself and deepen your knowledge on the industry that you are bringing your own expertise of governance. So what I learned on that FIFA a responsibility, where I was the deputy chair of the audit committee as part of their governance reforms, and then later the chair of the audit committee, was that in influencing change, it is very important to make sure that you do not leave people behind. And that is something that generally we people in finance as well will always feel, this is what needs to be done, whether it's cost cutting, whether you are imposing governance or control measures, or new strategies to drive growth in businesses. What I learned very fast is the importance of understanding the space. Because if you do not, you will actually end up missing the point. So that was very important. But again, I gave credit to a qualification of not just a chartered accountant, but a South African chartered accountant, because thankfully we are back onto our top spot in the globe as chartered accountants, because it is the top, the South African CA is the, most sought after globally. So being in that space, I saw myself as an export product, where I was exporting talent and skill of South Africa. And so what I learned with that as well, Peter, is that when people talk about global standards, we always think global standards is a standard out of South Africa. We as South Africans have got a number of pockets of global standards that we actually take to the world. So for me, it was a great segue after South Africa had demonstrated excellence in leading the World Cup the way it did. And then we got to stand up and be counted. And that is how one then landed amongst these global players as a leader to reform on governance.
Wow, exciting to hear, particularly the level of our CAs is top notch globally. Let's talk about mentorship, because we know that this is a crucial part of developing future leaders. How do you approach mentoring young professionals, particularly young women?
So I've had the honor of building mentorship relationships both informally and formally. Throughout my journey, being a young, CA, and raising my hand for a number of very difficult roles in our country, it did put some spotlight, which then attracted young people wanting to understand how I've navigated the journey. So one of the ways I've approached mentorship is really building some of those relationships and allowing them to build naturally. And what is important is also being authentic with some of these mentorship, roles, because sometimes young people see, as you say, that you're successful in this, you're successful in that. Success is relative. Number one. Number two, we also don't just step into it. There are a number of challenges that we come across along the way and we endure. And so it becomes important for me to share some of those with young people. And that has been my approach that says, let's look at the good and the bad of following some of these leadership journeys and roles that one has raised one's hand for, alongside the informal relationships that will probably build after after delivering a speech, and then young people will come and engage with you. I also have had an opportunity of launching formal mentorship programs through the African Women Chartered Accountants, which was also for me a responsibility that one felt, it hasn't been an easy journey. How sure that young people do not reinvent the wheel, where we share with them some of the pitfalls in some of the roles. I mean, Peter, I always talk openly about the fact that having gone to a township school, less exposure to business, I chose a business and a finance career. Auditing was tough. Auditing says, come and give an opinion on what you think has gone well and not gone well in this business. So you are coming as almost an advisor. Now, I had not even been exposed to a business environment. Now you are asking me to, write exams on a topic that is even more elevated. So I battled with my board exams. I passed my board exams the fourth attempt. And so by that time, and I always say to young people, I was now the best CA you can ever find, having been polished and grounded over 4 years instead of one.
That's a wonderful story, and I think an important one as well about perseverance. You're a strong advocate for women in business. What role do you see women playing in driving Africa's economic transformation going forward?
Peter, I believe, in the continent, women have already been playing a critical role in a number of, sectors. The one that is even close to my heart, because it's also our area of focus in our private equity, is the area of food security. So when you look at the agricultural produces in our continent, studies say 70% of those are actually delivered by women. So you can tell that already we are playing a role, but the question is that why are we not in the more meaningful spaces of these sectors, as an example? So it is important that we are owners of these means of production, where we are the ones also largely delivering on them. The other element that is critical in making sure that women are playing a significant role in driving transformation in the continent is a study I've just seen by McKinsey that says just in 2025, GDP growth that could be unlocked. GDP could unlock about 315 billion US dollars in 1 year across the continent if women especially around on the private equity space as well. So it is very important that women are not just seen as the workers in some of these sectors. Hospitality as well is another area. Healthcare spaces. We need to see women being in the decision-making platforms of these industries and playing a significant role even in the ownership, because women will generally not only build for themselves, but they build and impact families and impact communities. So inclusivity, financial inclusivity and inclusive growth will not be achieved in the continent when we are leaving women behind.
When we started this conversation, we talked about you getting into spaces where there was a lot of men and male-dominated environments. I would imagine then, along your journey as a woman, as a Black woman, there must have been a few hurdles and barriers that came just because of that identity. What did you encounter and how did you overcome them? Because there's probably a young woman now watching and thinking, how do I get to where you are and deal with the things that are around her?
That is correct, Peter. You would be seen in a boardroom, or you'd be seen in some of these leadership spaces, and naturally people will say, how did you get here? So you found that you had to work triple hard to demonstrate that I belong here. I am here because I am able to contribute to what is needed to be contributed here, and I can hold my own, and I know what my offering, and I know what I bring, and I'm here because I am bringing that for a difference. So what becomes very important is it's a difficult one, Peter, but to try make your work speak for itself than us also being too vocal, because my experience, and I'm talking indeed from experience, where sometimes the more vocal you become that gong that people think you are only here to just discuss transformation, be challenging, and grabbing every irritation that you and undermining that happens in the boardroom. I learned that I need to be very clear where I'm putting my energies, because that can drain you. It is very painful and it can be very hurtful when you are in a space with colleagues and peers, and yet your contribution continues to be undermined. So it is important to also be very strategic around, I'm now at the table. I need to be very clear what mark I leave that will speak for itself. So that became a very important lesson for me. The other one is not all the time you find your male colleagues, all of them thinking the same. Identify that colleague that is supporting you and can be your sponsor, and make sure you never disappoint. Because when they are sticking their head out for you, it is very important that everybody can see why your work needs to speak for itself. So those are some of the challenges that unfortunately we continue to face. The difference nowadays is that a young person steps into a boardroom, they can see Cindy, they can see, Wendy Duhabe, it becomes a lot better. What is important for us is to make the life of that young woman a lot easier, because I've also seen in other environments where it is us women who also make it difficult for another woman as board member. I've seen the importance when a young woman who's an executive coming to present to a board, that I must be their ally. I must be the one who is going to support them. So those are some of the lessons that I've also learned in this journey that continues to be difficult, but it is getting better, because there's still around 30% women leadership in leadership positions in our country, that's still very low. However, now you do see someone who looks like you, who understands your plight, and it's very important to collaborate.
I think you touched on this a little bit earlier on. I want to know a little bit more about what inspired African Chartered Women's Investment and AIH. What are you trying to do in this space? Why did you come together in this way?
So, as you say, it was inspired by something I touched on earlier, which was about giving back, realizing how tough this journey was to become a chartered accountant. We decided to get together. There were 4 of us, and we said, let us start by something simple. It was going back to the schools where we came from in the townships and young girls. And most importantly, what I latched on was that when I got to university, it was by chance that I had done maths higher grade. Most of my classmates were doing maths standard grade, and we get to university, and unfortunately they could not do BCom with maths standard grade. So that became a big bugbear because it was not communicated very clearly. So that became one of the things. I went back to school to talk to young people to say, as difficult as maths is, let's rather find ways of how you get assisted than you running away from it, because it is critical. So that was one of the things that really inspired us to start the Women AWCA and just do simple things. The other big thing that started coming out of AWCA was that not only is this network assisting us to lift as we rise, it became critical for ourselves, because we too were seeing these knocks I was talking about earlier, to say, you've got this qualification, which is one of the highest forms in accounting, and yet we will still have our own challenges, of unconscious biases. How do we win ourselves in the corporate environment? So it also then became a network for ourselves. Over time, when there were a number of professional organizations come, we realized the need to have this as a legacy, but also that it is funded, it is self-funded, because there are a number of programs that were coming up. We're starting to launch leadership programs, some of them international, with your likes of Duke University for our women CAs, because we also said, if we want to take leadership positions, our technical knowledge is not sufficient. We need to ground ourselves on broader business knowledge, broader leadership, and we started collaborating with other international organizations, and that required funding. We came together, and that is where the investment holding company was launched 6 years later. We formed AWCA Investment Holdings. It was a passive investment holding company for some time, because we were all still chasing our careers in the corporate environment. I, for one, loved the public sector, because I always knew that without our government pushing for our liberation, some of us would not have had the opportunity to occupy the spaces that we started to occupy. So I was very passionate about the public sector, Peter, and it is sad that we now see that a number of professionals do not make it and grow their careers in the public sector, given some of the challenges that we have seen, the corruption, where if you are bringing some governance and challenging, you get knocked out of the system. It is sad, because when you look back, you realize that some of our gems in the country, like your Sizwe Masanas, your Tulani Kabashes, your Glory Sirobes, most of them actually came from the public sector. Your Saki Matozomas, there was an era where Black excellence was the thing. So very passionate about the public sector. And so we had AWC Investments as a passive BEE company for a while. So when I then stepped out from my last public sector role, which was an executive role, I then came to run AWCA Investment Holdings on a full-time basis, very deliberate about it. And as they say, Peter, some things happen for a good reason, right? So when we started now being deliberate about driving the investments that we were doing, that is when we saw the importance of having a pot of capital firm. And at that time, as I say, even the South African Private Equity Association was now deliberately supporting up and coming professionals in starting private equity. So we did get a lot of support from SAFCA. There are a number of programs which are developing Black women private equity firms, and we were fortunate to be one of those. And so our maiden fund has also made headways, and we've made great investments in the financial sector and in the manufacturing space, which we like. Because of job creation, and as indicated, there's food security as well, because it drives growth and key element in our continent. And the last sweet spot of our investments that we drive as AIH Capital is technology, because that is what's going to drive some of the complex needs of our continent.
As we start to wrap up our conversations, this is the BRICS Africa channel, so we're going to talk a little bit about BRICS. And I just wonder if this is something as an investor, as someone who looks at business, private equity, is this something our continent should be embracing? Are there opportunities that come with a grouping such as BRICS? We're seeing more and more African countries coming into the grouping. And where do you see it? And is there an opportunity for African growth through the BRICS?
Definitely, Peter. I do believe that as an African continent, we have not done ourselves any favors by operating in silos. The BRICS on its own, which we are part of, it's great, as you say, to see countries like now joining BRICS, because as you are aware, I mean, BRICS commands more than 42%, of the GDP. So, what is important for us as the continent is realizing the importance of being co-designers of our economic future. That is what BRICS has actually allowed us, is the dignity of co-designing rather than getting instructions that come from somewhere, in the West, that undermines some of the large resources, natural resources that we can harness for the growth of our continent. It is sad, and to see the complexity of the continent where there is so much poverty, and yet we are so rich in natural resources. How I believe BRICS can be harnessed for the benefit of South Africa and a number of other countries in the continent is ensuring that we tap into the innovations and technologies that are rich in China, rich in India. For me, I would honestly like a situation where there is also very deliberate and intentional skills development that happens within the continent. We have seen that was some of our partners, bring their technologies. It's still held very close, to heart. And in some instances, a large of experts get brought into our country. South Africa used to be very good around managing that, especially around skills development, where we would time and say, by this time, we need to have had homegrown talent that can step into some of these opportunities. So when you look at just even the I guess for private equity, infrastructure development may not necessarily fit because private equity is usually short term, 5 to 7 years, you need to exit. However, in the value chain, some of the suppliers, some of the engineering businesses, and some of the technology businesses that can be started and grown in the continent that can then exist beyond the developmental periods is very critical, and that is where private equity can actually play a role for us. We need to make logistics easier within the continent. It's sad to see, SAA has to start from scratch. That was an airline, for example, that allowed, Africans to travel within the continent using our own, transport means. It's great to see Kenyan Airways. It's great to see Ethiopian Airlines, some strong airlines, Rwanda coming up very strongly. What is critical is for the Africa Trade Area Agreement to really start to shape up as well, because even BRICS, China will come and do deals with us individually, and will still not see the benefits and the gains of a BRICS, which I believe is a much better call for the South.
Okay, let's end here where we started with the story of the young Cindy. A lot has happened in between to get you to the present Cindy. What do you see for the future, Cindy? Big hopes, dreams, aspirations still to be fulfilled.
Right. We've been blessed with a private equity fund with funding which has been very difficult to raise. So now the next 18 months to 2 years, the focus is finding deals. It's a very good problem to have, where we've got funds and now we are looking for deals and assets to invest in particular in South Africa. So that is my focus for the next short to medium term, Peter. Having said that, there is so much work that we need to do amongst young women. And I see AWCA as a legacy organization of this country through which we are going to impact a number of women. Alongside the private equity fund, I am to say we are accelerating a bursary trust that is growing so that we are able to support education. And one of my passions on the work we have to do with AWCA is to start working with the ecosystem. A lot of work has done on the girl child. There's still a lot of work, no doubt. However, I am starting as somebody who also plays a very strong role in society. I am seeing cracks on the boy child. And so my vision is to continue doing some of the community work that I do in bringing the boy child to make sure that they too are supported, not just on technical skills, but I think the softer skills, self-development is very key in building an ecosystem. That is what I really am now bracing myself alongside making sure that we spend the money in the private equity fund.
Cindy, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for joining us on the BRICS Africa channel.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Peter. Much appreciated.